We trust the lamb, not the donkey or the elephant.
I think that's helpful. And it sounds like what you're saying is we need to let the biblical world, as much as we can, become our world. And we need to understand our world in the context of the biblical narrative, not the other way around, which is, of course, a huge temptation because we all come to the Bible with pre-configurations, presuppositions about the way the world should be. And it's a big book, so you can find passages that will affirm just about anything you want to personally affirm if you aren't reading with the grain of the story. But if you let the story, like you said, out-narrate, out-tell the story that you're currently living in, there may be some hope. One of my challenges, and this is more pastoral, is, even with the podcast, I'll often get people who will write very nice, sincere emails challenging something that we said, and they'll maybe send a few Bible passages saying, see, the Bible contradicts what you're communicating. And, I'll often go and look at the passage, and sometimes they're absolutely correct, and I need to say, hey, I got this one wrong. But other times, the passage is out of context, and like you said, if it's read with the grain of the biblical narrative, it doesn't actually say what someone might think it says on the surface. But I always have a challenge responding because it starts sounding very elitist, as though you need to have an MDiv or a PhD, and you need to really understand the full sweep of the Bible to engage culture deeply as a Christian. And so I think there's a populist critique of this particular position, which would say, hey, I think the Bible is for everyone, and the biblical narrative and the biblical story can speak to anyone, and you're putting a lot of guardrails up, as you just said, that make it difficult for an everyday Christian to read the Bible and think about culture in the way that you've described. So what would you say? I mean, how can an everyday average Christian who doesn't have time to go to seminary or read many fine leather-bound books avoid the cherry-picking problem? How do we help shore up some of these weaknesses?
Talking about ordinary and everyday Christians, I think there's a danger at its worst that language buys into a very worldly view of things. So I reckon I wouldn't be surprised if when we get to heaven, the people who are sort of paraded and have the celebrations about them are going to be, the octogenarian grandmothers who prayed for 2 hours every day and nobody ever knew about it in their lives. Their star sort of celebrity pastor has a seat in the back row cheering them on. I think there's going to be an upside downness to heaven that should give us caution about the way in which that language of ordinary can be taken. And so, if we want to use a different vocabulary, we might have something like, how should the sons and daughters of the king engage with these ideas if they haven't been to seminary? So I don't. That probably came over as much harsher than it. I'm not sort of say anything about that. It's just my sense of that language is I find it hard. Anyway.
Oh, I appreciate it, and you have not offended me. But I think you're right. And the way I use everyday Christian is certainly not with any casting down or looking down. I mean, as a pastor, I think of myself as an everyday Christian as well, but I'm very aware of the fact that I've had this amazing opportunity to go to seminary, to have an education that not many Christians would love to have. They would just tell me, gosh, if I could set down my job and go do exactly what you did, I would love to do that. But it's not what God's called me to do. And I don't want to communicate a way of reading the Bible or thinking about how we engage with culture, which, as we already said, is pretty much everything that implies to them, you need to be like me. You need to have my degrees. You need to have my knowledge to really do this well. I'm very fearful about that. So how would you respond to that kind of pastoral concern?
Absolutely. I think if anyone sort of gets the impression that in order to live well as a Christian and to understand and critique the culture, you need a seminary degree, then you and I have very badly communicated. So let's try and make sure that doesn't happen. I think any Christian who reads the Bible has all the tools that she or he needs, and at its simplest, but not at its most simplistic. So this is still really deep, very simple to express. The shape of the Bible story is creation and fall and redemption and consummation. Now, you don't even need to use those big words. God made the world, human beings turned away from him. God is rescuing them, and he will judge the world and take his people to be with him, forever. And that's, in a sense, that's the shape of all cultural critique. And that's the distinctive Christian way of reading culture. Now, for those people who want a book to go away and read on this is Herman Doiviert in The Roots of Western Culture. But all he's doing is bringing out this truth from the Bible. And he says all other cultures that he's aware of have a binary way of understanding how the world works. So there are two principles. So for the ancient Greeks, it was form and matter. And then for the medieval period, it was nature and grace. And for us, it's nature and freedom. Now, in a sense, that doesn't matter, but that's the philosophical background to this. And then he said, but Christianity is really different and really weird because it doesn't have just two terms that are in opposition to each other, but it has a story. And other views of the world don't have a story because there's nothing fundamental that changes over time. But for Christians, there is. Like with the fall, something fundamentally changed. And then with redemption, something fundamentally changes. Life is not, the world is not the same place after these things. And that's really quite strange in the context of different ways of looking at the world. And because Christians have a story, creation, fall, redemption, they can look at the world in much subtler and more complex ways than other people. So, for example, I can say that as a human being, I'm created in the image of God, and all human beings are created in the image of God. And that means that we have a great dignity and a great worth in God's eyes. We're not nothing. We're not just more dust. But we also know from Genesis 3 that we've turned away from God, and that the cursed is the ground, and so forth, and that life, therefore, in this world at the moment is not as it should be, and it's messed up in all sorts of different ways. And even that, relatively straightforward insight is just culturally the gift that never stops giving, because it helps you to understand that how human beings are capable of such wonderful acts of self-sacrificial love and care and so forth, but also how we're capable of things like mass murder and genocide, and it's really hard to get a way of understanding human beings that can account for both of those if you don't have a story. Because what single principle can give you both someone who will die for someone they haven't met because they want to save their life and give you a beautiful concerto and wonderful work of art, and also the death camps and child torture and whatever. Like, it's really hard. But because the Bible is a story, creation, fall, redemption, it allows you to account for human beings in a much richer way. And so that's just one example of how just starting on from these four words, creation, fall, redemption, consummation, it gives you an incredibly rich way of engaging with culture.
Hey, I'm Keith. Thanks for watching the video. If you're interested in ending tribalism like we are, we have a podcast and a book. Both are called Truth Over Tribe. You can listen to the podcast on Apple or Spotify, and you can get the book off Amazon. I hope you'll check them out.